Hello, everyone. I am Laurel Birchfield. I'm the Associate Director at Mainstream Coalition, and thank you for joining us tonight for our KS Fair Maps training Representation Matters. Just a couple housekeeping things before we get started. We do, as I mentioned, we are recording this so that we can put it up on our YouTube channel for Mainstream Coalition and ask our partners to share it out as well. After this event, probably tomorrow, you'll receive information from this, including the recording and the slide deck. So don't feel like you have to frantically take notes through this. We will send this out afterwards. The transcripts are live, so you have the option to turn the captions on if you would like to see those. I think you can also turn them off using one of the buttons at the bottom of your screen. If you are not speaking, if you're not a presenter tonight, I'm just going to ask you to make sure you're on mute so we can minimize the background noise. We will have plenty of time, I hope, for Q&A at the end. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask, we're going to have opportunities in our breakout room or as the full group at the end of the session. Or if you want to get those questions in, you can put them into chat, and if we can answer them by typing in, we'll do so. Otherwise, we'll save them for the end and we'll handle all the questions at the very end of our event. Let me just make sure. I think that is everything regarding our housekeeping. I just want to again say thank you for joining us. For those who have joined after we started, we are recording this event. And we have a really great agenda tonight full of fantastic partners of the KS Fair Maps Coalition. So I'm excited to go ahead and introduce you to them. If this is your first event with KS Fair Maps, let me tell you a little bit about who we are and what we hope to do. We are a nonpartisan grassroots education and engagement effort. We formed last fall because we knew that the redistricting process was starting and that there were going to be a lot of hurdles for us to overcome in order to see the ultimate outcome that we desire, which is fair and transparent maps for Kansas. And so several of the organizations that you see on the screen came together and started engaging people for options to submit testimony during the listening sessions that happened last fall, and have been working tirelessly throughout this time to train folks, to get them prepared to speak up and to be part of this redistricting process. So I'm not going to say all of the different coalition partners, but you can see them listed on the screen. And if you go to our website, ksfairmaps.org, you can also see all of this information. There's also an option to sign up to receive updates at ksfairmaps.org. Most of you on this event probably received the email inviting you because you signed up for those alerts. But we're trying to make sure that as many people as possible are engaged in this effort. So I encourage you to sign up for updates and share with your network, your friends, family, and neighbors, as they also can sign up for updates. And I think, let me go through tonight's agenda very quickly. We're going to start with a brief overview of redistricting, and then we're going to talk about the most important part of this process, which is talking about our community and representing our community with legislators as they prepare to draw maps. Regina Nazir from Loudlight is going to cover those topics for us. And then we're going to go to Tom Witt with Equality Kansas, who's going to talk to us about the process, about writing and giving verbal testimony, and is going to use his depth of knowledge for how to talk to legislators to give you all tips on how to be effective and how to be heard. And then we're going to take time to break out into rooms where we have more intimate opportunities to talk through questions and to prepare. We have a fantastic crew of folks who are going to be leading those breakout rooms, so I'll introduce you to later. And then we'll just close all together as a group. We're hoping to be closer to 7 o'clock than the 7:30 that was advertised with this event, but I believe we'll be able to stay on to answer any questions if we run long. And with that, I'm going to turn it over. Maybe. Nope, I apologize. I have issues with my computer at times. Let's try this again. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Regia to go ahead and kick it off for us. Regia?
Hi, everyone. My name is Regina Nazir, and I'm with a community organizer with Loudlight. I'm just going to go over some really basic knowledge about redistricting, gerrymandering, and just common community interests. So oftentimes we see the word redistricting come up on our feeds, our news feeds, and just the news in general. The legal definition to redistricting is the process of enacting new congressional and state legislative district boundaries. So what does that mean? All representatives and legislators are elected from divisions called districts. These districts are redrawn every 10 years after the census is conducted. And then you can move on to the next slide. So this is kind of just a diagram of how the census kind of trickles down into new district lines. But it is required by federal law that said districts cannot discriminate on the basis of race and ethnicity. And just keep that in mind. We'll come back to it. And we can go to the next slide. So there are certain requirements and guidelines that the state must follow. Number one, it must be physically adjacent. It can't be on opposite sides of the state. Number two, compactness. Constituents must live as near to one another as possible. So this includes like neighborhoods or communities. And then speaking of communities, there must be a community of interest. So that means a region or neighborhood that shares political, social, and economic interests. So that may include something like a religious group. So if there are Christian groups, Jewish groups, Muslim groups, and they're all very close to one another, that would be a community of interest. And we can move on to the next slide. So yeah, a community interest is going to be anything that is shared in knowledge, whether that be like a historical neighborhood, maybe a neighborhood that was historically segregated and now is a general area that is shared by a certain race or ethnicity. It isn't exclusive to ethnicity and race, but oftentimes it does lead to that. So gerrymandering is also a part of redistricting that we oftentimes hear about. That is the practice of drawing lines to favor a party, individual, or constituency over another. This is typically racially motivated. And in 1995, the US Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Johnson that racial gerrymandering is a violation of constitutional rights. This often happens today, even though it is illegal, just because there are certain ways that politicians are find a way to get around that without explaining this is why, this is the racial group that we're trying to separate. So in Wichita specifically, that is where I am based out of, there are different racial groups and ethnic groups that are in different areas of the city. And oftentimes those are those shared communities of interest. And they often have very similar political ideologies, similar concerns. So those would be a community of interest. So now I will pass it off to Tom Witt with Equality Kansas to talk about giving testimony.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Looks like quite a good list of participants tonight. So there's a saying that one of the most important parts of politics is showing up. And if we're going to show up as citizens of Kansas to let the legislature know our views, the way we do that for the most part is by testifying in legislative committees. And the House and the Senate both have their own redistricting committees. Sometimes they meet at different times, sometimes they meet at the same time in different rooms. I assume that later in the session we may have joint meetings, but you want to be able to submit testimony either in person or in writing, because that's how we get our views on the record, both for the decision-making process in the State House and for eventual litigation. And we can go to the next slide, please. So written testimony, you can write as much or as little as you want, but it has to be submitted to the committee assistant at least 24 hours in advance. And on this slide are the Senate and House committee assistants for the two redistricting committees. Now, they may have rules for how it has to be formatted, but we can help you if you decide you want to submit testimony. We can help you make sure that your written testimony it meets the proper form that the legislative committees want to see it in. Now, because of the COVID pandemic, it used to be that all testimony had to be delivered in person if you were going to do in person. But because of the pandemic, for the past 2 legislative sessions, all the State House committee rooms are wired for streaming video and sound. And there's a lot of people who are presenting testimony virtually over WebEx. If you do register to testify virtually, the committee assistants will send you a link to the WebEx conference so that you can go ahead and get signed in. Now, time limits, if they're playing fair, everybody's supposed to get the same amount of time to speak to the committee, but they don't always play fair. But generally expect that you're going to have between 2 and 5 minutes, probably closer to 2 or 3 minutes, mainly because there's so many people that want to speak to the legislature about the redistricting process. If we could go ahead and go on to the next slide, that would be great. So parts of written testimony, your name and organization you represent. If you're not representing an organization, you don't have to have one. Your contact information. Now on the slide, it says address, email, and phone. You don't actually have to put that in the header of the testimony. You have to provide it to the committee assistant, but understand that your written testimony is part of the public record. It is available on the legislature's website once the hearing begins. And like anything else on the internet, it's there forever. So don't release any personal, don't dox yourself is basically the advice here. Then you'll say whether you're a proponent, an opponent, or whether your testimony is neutral. And then you need to note in the header if it's verbal in person, verbal via WebEx, or written only. The date of the hearing and the committee that the hearing is being held by. Let's see. There was one thing I wanted to mention here. I'll catch up to it. So the next slide is the parts of your testimony. Your opening, you'll greet the committee members. So good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, or good afternoon, Madam Chair. You want to thank for the opportunity to be here to talk to them. We can go on to the next slide, please. So in your written, I know what I wanted to say. If you're going to, this is important. If you're going to provide in-person testimony, you might have to respond to questions. If you're only providing written testimony, you won't be asked any questions. So just, you can also provide written testimony and be in the hearing room, but if you're not standing at the podium, they can't question you. So just know that if you do testimony in person, that they may be able to ask you questions. So you'll want to explain in your testimony why you're concerned about the legislative maps. Talk about your community of interest, whether it's a racial minority, or in the case for us at Equality Kansas, our community of interest is LGBT people who live everywhere in the state of Kansas. If we could go ahead and go on to the next slide. So if your community of interest has physical boundaries, talk about them. If you are in a neighborhood that you don't want to see split between legislative districts, say that. If it's a small town, talk about how your small town needs to be represented by one state representative or one state senator. Talk about whatever demographics connect you to your local community of interest. If we could go to the next slide, please. So how would you like to see your district And importantly for these hearings, what would be the impact on your community if you were split into 2, 3, or 4 state house or state senate districts? And what would that do to your ability to meet with legislators who represent your community? You know, sometimes it can be pretty tough to meet with your state senator or your state representative. Imagine if you're trying to represent a community of interest and you have to meet with 3 or 4. It gets a lot tougher to get that done. And that's one of the reasons why the rules around community of interest are part of the redistricting standard that's been set by the state of Kansas. Now, there's a standard, but it doesn't mean that the legislature actually follows that standard. If we could go to the next slide, please. So in your closing, restate why you're there, what you think should be done with the neighborhood or community of interest where you live, and speak clearly. So in giving verbal testimony, if we could go to that slide. So this is really important. Do not stand at the podium and read your testimony. What happens then is the legislators, they all have copies of your written testimony. And so instead of paying attention to you, they will follow along as you read your testimony. And it doesn't give you the best opportunities to make connections with them. So you'll always want to make frequent eye contact. And instead of reading your testimony, you want to summarize it. You want to say what's on your mind, what's in your heart, not what you've got written down on paper. And it's okay to be a little more colloquial, a little less formal in your speaking than you might be in your written testimony. Now, you may come into it, you may be expecting to have 4 or 5 minutes to speak, and then you walk into the committee room and the committee chair announces that everybody gets 2 minutes to speak. So, and this happens fairly frequently in all the committees. So what I carry a highlighter in my briefcase, and once I know what my time limit's going to be, I will quickly go through my written testimony and highlight the key phrases that I want to make sure I say and that I don't miss. That's really important because so most people, the average speaking speed is anywhere from 110 to about 200 words a minute. But when people are doing public speaking, they speed up. And so you'll see people at 150 to 200 words a minute. Try to bring your speech a little bit slower than that 200 words a minute because you will lose your audience. Don't try to do this off a phone or a tablet. Technology can fail you. Internet connections in the State House can sometimes be a bit problematic, especially if there's a lot of people in the State House flooding their wireless. So turn to stand up and speak. Oh, it looks like that's my last slide. Don't be afraid of speaking to these people. They are used to average citizens coming in and talking to them. And they even the most heinous of the legislators, if you are a citizen off the street coming in to talk to them in a committee, they will be kind and civil to you. They're only mean to people like me, but that's because I pick fights in committee.
Have we lost Tom?
Laurel?
Oh, hi. Sorry, I lost you. I don't know if that was my internet connection or yours.
I'm not sure.
All right.
I'm done. Go ahead.
We lost him.
All right. Thank you. So Tom, I think we lost you. Do you want to restate just the last 30 seconds or so of what you said?
Sorry. Where did you all see me drop off? What was I saying?
I don't remember, but it was brilliant.
don't be afraid to talk to them. They'll be nice to people.
Ironically,
That's
I
all you
think it
need.
was right after you said there would be technical difficulties.
I think that kind of proved my point. Don't try to read off a tablet or a phone. Take paper testimony into the hearing room with you, because you can make notes and you can highlight. And one of the things that I was saying right at my close is, don't be afraid. They're used to average Kansas citizens coming in and talking to them, and even the most heinous and horrible of these legislators will be kind and civil to you in a hearing. And they're only mean to people like me, and that's because I pick fights in committee hearings. But that's a different story for a different day. Laurel?
Well, we're grateful for you picking those fights because you're fighting the good fight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Regia. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. So the reason why we're covering all of this today and why we had these presentations for you is because we're expecting those state, House, and Senate maps to drop any day. And with the congressional map process, things moved very fast and we had very limited time to provide feedback and provide testimony. So we're trying to get ahead of that this time. We're trying to make sure that all of you, all of our partners are prepared to give feedback as soon as those maps are introduced. Recognizing that these are going to be very complex maps that have a lot of data with them. And so as we talk about preparing testimony right now, we are being purposely broad in the topics that we're putting forward, knowing that the maps that are introduced are going to be specific. But right now, we want to take some time to break out into some rooms with some of the leaders from KS Fair Maps to We talked about how to submit testimony, both written and verbal, and Tom had excellent advice for all of you that I hope you will consider as you're drafting. I'm going to show you in just a minute a helpful tool that we've set up and we have used in the past. Some of you may have even used it yourself. That will streamline that for you and hopefully make this whole thing very simple. But we're going to be submitting testimony just to the committees. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't also be talking to your legislator. And so I'm going to ask Tom to speak a little bit about how to engage with your legislator and what to do.
So if you want to talk to your legislator directly, it's actually very easy. Staff there is pretty thin and their job is more administrative than it is political. The secretaries aren't there to keep people out. They're kind of there to help people reach their lawmakers. But anybody that's in this group that wants to meet with their lawmaker, if you need help getting an appointment set up or help finding where they are, I'm putting my contact information in the chat right now. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm in the State House nearly every day. And I am happy to help get people to where they need to go or help you get appointments made.
Thank you, Tom. And Tom knows everybody in the State House, so he will definitely help you get where you need to go. And as we talk about making an impact, submitting testimony about the maps, about your communities to the committee is the first step, but every legislator is going to vote on these maps eventually. So it is a good kind of best practice to go ahead and start talking to them now. And then Beth and I had a nice conversation in our little room of two about kind of how to get involved in this. And we talked about bringing others into this effort. The best way that we can make sure that we're heard is to speak a lot and to speak loudly and to have a lot of voices. And so if you have people in your community, whether that's a neighbor or someone at your job or someone who is part of a program that you participate in at like the library or at a community center or an advocacy organization, get them involved in this, get them to come out and speak about these issues as well. Bring a friend. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it tonight and just say thank you. Again, thank you to our presenters. Thank you to our breakout room leaders. Thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. This is a highly kind of technical issue that is not the most exciting. And so the fact that you guys are interested and engaged and involved and thinking about what this means for the next 10 years in Kansas means a lot. And so thank you for having that interest. please get others involved. Let us know how we can help you. I'll send out information from this meeting and just stay in touch so that we can support you through this process.